To see you all here this afternoon for the fifth and final lecture in this year's Whitehall Lecture Series. This is our 28th year of doing the Whitehall Lecture Series, and we focus each year on a different theme. This year was on the presidents of the Gilded Age, particularly those that don't get as much attention as some of the other presidents. And this is our fifth and final lecture on President Rutherford B. Hayes. Before we get started, though, let me just thank the museum staff for the hard work they put into getting this lecture series put together and then organizing the logistics for each of the lectures on these consecutive Sundays. And let me also take just a minute to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Just don't take it for granted, please. Just actually check your cell phone and make sure it's off so that it doesn't disturb the lecture. If you happen to make it into the room with one of the audio tour ones, would you hold that up so that the staff can collect those? Those audio tour ones have built-in alarms, and the AV system in this room will set that alarm off occasionally, and it will really get your attention. We webcast these lectures live, meaning that no matter where you are in the world, if you can't physically join us here in the grand ballroom of Whitehall, you can go to the museum's website, go to the lecture series page, go to the lecture you're interested in that's being given that day. Click on a button there that will download a short routine to your computer and allow you to hear the lecture live and to see the same slides that are being shown to the audience here in the grand ballroom. And with that, I should welcome those who've joined us online as well. So if you happen to be away and can't attend one, you can still be a part of this lecture live. If you miss it altogether, you can go back to the museum's homepage at any time you like and click on the icon in the lower right-hand corner for the Gilded Age History Channel. That icon will take you, that link will take you to a program page where there are more than 100 programs that are archived there that you can listen to and enjoy at your leisure on a variety of subjects about the Gilded Age. Our sponsors for this lecture series are the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post, and we very much appreciate their support. With their support, these kinds of programs are possible here. You have at each of your chairs a season program guide for the museum's programs this season, and there's a lot going on. I hope you'll take time to look through this program guide and join us for other programs here at the museum throughout the year. Our lecturer today is Roy Morris, Jr., who is a former newspaper reporter and political writer. He was the founding editor of America's Civil War for about 13 years before assuming his current post as editor of Military Heritage. He's been a consultant on various television projects like for A&E and for the History Channel, and he edited a 3-book series on the Civil War as well. More importantly for us, he's written 7 books, all set during the time period we interpret here at the museum, the period we call America's Gilded Age. He wrote a book on Twain called Lighting Out for Territory, about Twain's transformation from Samuel Clemens to Mark Twain as he moved westward in the country. He wrote a book about Lincoln and Douglas called The Long Pursuit. He wrote a book about Rutherford B. Hayes, which is of course the subject of our lecture today, called Fraud of the Century. A book about Ambrose Bierce, who was a journalist for William Randolph Hearst, called The Better Angel, and a book about Sheridan. His most recent book, Declaring His Genius, is about Oscar Wilde and was just published by the Purdue University Press. So I think he's the right guy to talk to us about Rutherford B. Hayes, and we're privileged to have Roy Morris here to join us for the Whitehall Lecture Series. Thank you for being here, Roy, and please tell us about Rutherford B. Hayes.
Well, thank you all for coming today. First of all, can you hear me okay? That's the first question I always have to ask. I'd like to thank John Blades and Allison Goff for inviting me to speak in such a beautiful surroundings as the Flagler. It really is a wonderful, unique place to visit, and my wife Leslie and I have really enjoyed seeing it. I want to talk today about the presidential election of 1876. In many ways, the most complex and controversial election in American history. The subtitle for today's talk is The Election of Preston Hayes, It might as well have been called the unelection of President Tilden, since it's my belief that Samuel Tilden was actually elected president on November 7th, 1876. He just couldn't hold on to the White House. His unelection began on election night and actually lasted for 4 months, while the American people waited impatiently to learn who their next president would be. Tensions, as you can imagine, ran high. Barely a decade after the end of the Civil War, another war seemed all too possible, this one between the two rival political parties. It's a mystery in a way how two upright, honest, and essentially colorless individuals as Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden came to be involved in the most sensational and sordid election in American history. That's a story in itself, and one that I'll try to get into a little today. The election of 1876 took place during the nation's year-long centennial celebration. An estimated 9 million Americans, or almost 1/5 the population of the country at the time, visited the epicenter for the centennial celebration, which was in Philadelphia. They went to tour the Great Centennial exhibit. They could see, among other things, George Washington's false teeth, Benjamin Franklin's printing press, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, and the most popular exhibit was the giant coreless engine, which animated 13 acres worth of heavy machinery at the fair. Human exhibits at the fair included such things as wild men from Borneo, wild children from Australia, pure and unadulterated man-eaters from the Fiji Islands, and even a woman who weighed 602 pounds, who some people said should have been displayed in the machinery hall. Here we see opening day at the centennial celebration in Philadelphia. 186,000 people came that first day. President Ulysses S. Grant gave the opening remarks. For some reason, he insisted on facing sideways while he read his speech, and few in the crowd could actually hear what he had to say. It was probably just as well. Centennial mania gripped the country in a way that the upcoming presidential election did not. Part of the reason for the public apathy was exhaustion after eight long years of scandal, corruption, and mismanagement during the outgoing Grant administration. Is it just me, or does President Grant always look ill at ease in civilian clothes? He always looks better in his Union general's outfit. Of course, he was a much better general than he proved to be president. I think he actually knew that as well as anyone. Certainly, most people at the time considered Grant's years in the White House to have been a national embarrassment at best and a moral and political train wreck at worst. In fact, both Hayes and Tilden owed their nominations in large part to Grant, whose scandal-ridden administration had created a real hunger in the American people for a return to good, honest government. When the Republican Party met in Cincinnati in June 1876 to nominate a president, there were two front-runners, Maine Congressman James G. Blaine and New York Senator Roscoe Conkling. These two had despised each other for years, ever since getting into an argument on the floor of Congress, and neither man would give an inch, and both controlled the largest block of delegates. So finally, on the 7th ballot, the deadlock convention turned to Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes, a relatively obscure career politician and one who had no known scandals in his past, and unlike Blaine and Conkling, had actually served in the Civil War. Here's a picture of Hayes in uniform. He was an overprotected youth himself. His only brother had drowned while ice skating when Hayes was 2. And Rutherford grew up a nervous, introverted child. He had a nervous breakdown actually in his mid-20s out of fear that he would lose his mind, which was something that apparently several of his relatives had done. Against all odds, he proved to be a surprisingly good soldier. In his acceptance letter to the Republican convention, nominees didn't appear at the convention in those days. He promised a return to good, honest government, a reform of the civil service system, and an elimination of bribery and corruption in Washington. Compared to the other Republican candidates, such as Blaine and Conkling, he was squeaky clean. So was his wife, a tireless temperance crusader known as Lemonade Lucy, for her refusal to serve alcoholic beverages at official state functions. Here's Lemonade Lucy. At her parties, it was said the water flowed like wine. My daughter's name is Lucy too, actually, but she was born several years before I wrote Fraud of the Century, so there's no personal connection between her and Mrs. Hayes, although I've got to say I've never met a Lucy I didn't like. Privately, many Republicans agreed with Henry Adams Jr., who considered Rutherford B. Hayes a third-rate non-entity and fully expected to lose the White House after 8 long years of the Grant administration, as well as the lingering effects of a 3-year-long depression that had put 3 million Americans out of work. Democrats held their convention in St. Louis 2 weeks later. They were studying contrast. They were absolutely giddy with the notion of winning back the White House after 16 years of Republican rule. The man they nominated, 62-year-old New York Governor Samuel Tilden, seemed eminently qualified to be president. Tilden had spent 3 decades as a crusading attorney, a party activist, a state assemblyman, and governor of New York. Here's Tilden. He was a lifelong bachelor, and during the ensuing campaign, there were several cartoons showing him wearing a dress, which was a not so subtle suggestion that he was gay. My sense, for what it's worth, is that he wasn't much interested in either sex. He lived and breathed politics 24 hours a day. Privately incorruptible himself, Tilden led a crusade against bribe-taking corrupt politicians across the country, particularly New York City power broker William Marcy Boss Tweed, who controlled the city through his notorious Tammany Hall patronage machine. Tilden's leadership role in destroying the Tweed ring actually won him the governorship in 1874 and made him an immediate frontrunner for the Democratic nomination 2 years later. He was easily nominated on the second ballot in St. Louis, and in his acceptance letter, he too promised to end corruption in Washington. His party platform, he said, could be summed up in one word: reform. This Republican cartoon takes a dim view of Tilden's campaign. In it, you can see the various Democratic suspects. There's a big city ward healer, a Catholic priest, a Ku Klux Klan member, a Tammany Hall Indian, and an escaped convict. The rag baby of reform on the right is crying because Tilden was actually what was known as a hard money Democrat who did not favor going to the greenback system. The Republicans, of course, didn't intend to give up the White House without a fight. They'd held it for 16 years. They could hardly run on the Grant administration's record, so they fell back on the tried and true tactic of waving the bloody shirt, reviving the old wounds of the Civil War. They reminded Union veterans that not every Democrat was a rebel, but every rebel was a Democrat. And they also advised Union veterans to vote as you shot. Hayes, who had been wounded 4 times himself during the Civil War as a colonel and later general of the 23rd Ohio Infantry, privately encouraged the Bloody Shirt campaign, although publicly he remained on the high road. He agreed with his old wartime comrade Judson Kilpatrick that what was really needed during the campaign was what, quote, a bloody shirt campaign with plenty of money. That's pretty much what the Republicans came up with. Democrats in the South gave added credibility to the Republican charges by routinely terrorizing African American voters in their states. Here's a lurid cartoon showing a Southern Democrat standing over one of his young victims. The caption, if you can't see it, says, "In self-defense, if I hadn't killed you, you would have grown up to rule over me." Well, by this time, only 3 Southern states were still under Reconstruction governments: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The rest had reverted to local rule. In Southern terms, they had become redeemed. The primary aim of Democrats in the 3 unredeemed states was to elect Democratic governors and retake local control of their political destiny. The party's presidential nominee, the Northerner Tilden, was almost an afterthought. Relatively speaking, the election of 1876 was nonviolent, particularly when compared to the incredibly violent midterm election 2 years earlier, in which many of these southern states were redeemed. There were a few scattered outbreaks of violence, but for the most part, both parties fell back on the tried and true tactics of vote buying, ballot stuffing, and turnout suppressing. In Louisiana, a pair of imaginative Republicans came up with what was known as the sewing machine swindle. 1 week before the election, 9,000 advertising flyers for a fictitious company known as the Southern Sewing Machine Company were mailed out to registered Democratic voters. Postmen were ordered to return any undelivered flyers immediately, and those voters who did not receive flyers were immediately struck from the voting rolls. In the end, some 8,000 registered voters in New Orleans were disenfranchised, including many of the city's oldest and leading families. In Florida, Democratic landowners warned their African American sharecroppers that a vote for Hayes would severely affect their credit. Republican railroad owners, on the other hand, handed out numbered ballots to be turned in at the polls and threatened to fire any worker who was seen attending a Democratic campaign rally. One Democratic superintendent turned the tables by sending a number of African American workers to Alabama to repair non-existent railroad damage. Their train conveniently broke down and left them stranded on the side of the tracks until after the election was over. In the 3rd unredeemed state, South Carolina, former Confederate cavalry leader Wade Hampton had been nominated for governor by the Democrats. Hampton's supporters wore their own version of the bloody shirt, a bright red flannel shirt that threatened implicitly to kill anyone who dared to oppose them at the polls. Here's Wade Hampton in later life. He ended up commanding Robert E. Lee's cavalry after Jeb Stuart was killed at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in May of 1864. Hampton, like Hayes, was wounded several times during the war and almost died twice from saber or gunshot wounds to the head. As far as I know, there aren't any surviving photos of Hampton wearing one of the infamous red shirts from the campaign. He was probably too smart a politician to be photographed. We come to election day. Both Hayes and Tilden fully expected Tilden to win the election. By the end of the day, Tilden was ahead by 260,000 votes, the modern equivalent of 1.5 million popular votes. In Columbus, Hayes issued a statement saying that he was at peace with the results. Lemonade Lucy went to bed early with a sick headache. Meanwhile, in New York City, Samuel Tilden, usually the most reluctant of campaigners, spent the day greeting voters, shaking hands, and then hosting a lavish victory celebration at his mansion on Gramercy Park. He went to bed that night in the minds of many people, including himself, as President-elect of the United States. Well, then came the sort of unlikely occurrence that a modern screenwriter wouldn't even dare to invent. Late on election night, while President-elect Tilden slept 4 blocks away, a one-legged former Union general named Daniel Sickles happened to drop by Republican headquarters at the Fifth Avenue Hotel on the corner of 23rd Street. Here is Daniel Sickles on another street corner 20 years earlier in the act of murdering his wife's unarmed lover, Philip Barton Key, the son of Francis Scott Key of Star Spangled Banner fame. Sickles actually got away with his crime by pleading temporary insanity. It was the first time such a defense had been used successfully in an American court of law. It ruined his political career, but kept him out of jail. Abraham Lincoln's future Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, was the lead attorney for Sickles on the case. On election night, Sickles was on his way home after attending a Broadway play. He expected to find GOP headquarters buzzing with activity. Instead, the place was as dead as a funeral parlor. There was only one person still there, a lowly clerk who was boxing up the records of a losing campaign. Tilden said the clerk had been elected. Sickles refused to believe it. He asked to see the latest returns. The clerk said that they were sitting on the desk of party chairman Zachariah Chandler, who had already gone to bed with a bottle of whiskey for a companion. Shuffling through the returns, Sickles had nothing less than an epiphany. Tilden had won 184 sure electoral votes, but he lacked one vote to win the White House. If Rutherford B. Hayes managed somehow to hold on to the votes in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the 3 unredeemed states, he would end up with 185 electoral votes. Despite Tilden's enormous lead in the popular vote total, Hayes would be elected president. Since there was no one else around, Sickles took it upon himself to send out telegrams to the Republican governors in the 3 southern states, telling them to do whatever possible to hold on to their state for Hayes. While Sickles was sitting around the empty headquarters waiting for a reply to his telegrams, another partisan Republican, New York Times editor John C. Reed happened to drop by. Reed had been a prisoner of war at Andersonville's infamous prison during the Civil War, and he had little love lost for Southerners in general or Democrats in particular. When Reed and his other editors were sitting around trying to decide how to headline the next morning's election, they received a number of telegrams from worried Democrats asking specifically about the vote totals from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. They wondered what was going on. Reed hurried over to Republican headquarters to try to find out. By then, Sickles had gone home for the night, but Reed ran into another Republican operative, William Chandler, no relation to Zachariah, but secretary of the Republican National Committee. Don't let Chandler's bland expression fool you. He was a highly skilled political professional, somewhat like James Baker maybe in George H.W. Bush's administration. He had also served as campaign manager for Ulysses S. Grant's 2 campaigns for president. Well, Reed and Chandler dashed upstairs to Zachariah Chandler's hotel room and pounded on the door till he woke up and told him that despite what he may have believed, the election was far from over. They convinced him to send out a new round of telegrams to the governors in the 3 unredeemed southern states. Then they jumped into a carriage and hurried to the nearest Western Union Telegraph office, where they sent out new telegrams and charged it to the New York Times account. By then it was 7 a.m. on the day after the election, and Samuel Tilden was no longer president-elect. In a foreshadowing of what took place in Florida after the 2000 election, dozens of political operatives from both parties rushed south. William Chandler led the way, coming to Florida with $10,000 cash stuffed literally in a carpet bag. This cartoon depicts actually a Democrat. This is former New York Governor John Hoffman, seen carrying a check urging him to buy 1 vote for Tilden. As in the year 2000, Republicans largely outmaneuvered Democrats in the post-election struggle. Meanwhile, Hayes had privately written in his diary that he still believed he had lost the election. Meanwhile, Tilden was reassuring his now suddenly worried friends that, quote, "the American people are too patriotic, too intelligent, and too self-poised to permit the election to be stolen from me. The fiery zealots of the Republican Party may attempt to count me out, but I don't think the better class of Republicans will allow it." He turned out to be wrong about that. While political operatives from both parties were descending on the South, Ulysses S. Grant sent 7 companies of troops to the 3 southern states to keep the peace. In Tallahassee, things were already so peaceful that the troops simply threw their weapons down on the straight grounds and went off fishing instead. Meanwhile, Grant transferred more troops to Washington and put them in place around the federal arsenal. The USS Wyoming began steaming up and down the Potomac, and companies of Marines occupied strategic railroad bridges across the river. William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's old partner in the Civil War, arrived to take command of the defense of Washington. Here's a cartoon wondering why there's suddenly so many troops in Washington. The artist, Thomas Nast, was a diehard Republican, and he tried to soften the implied criticism of Grant by making the soldiers out to be toy soldiers. The suggestion was it was all fun and games. It was far from that. Electoral votes had to be certified by what were known as returning boards. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina had Republican governors, and so all 3 boards were occupied by Republican majorities. After several weeks of public and private meetings and rumors of bribe taking on the part of election officials, the 3 boards in the southern states threw out just enough Democratic votes to put Hayes ahead, although Democratic governors had been easily elected at the same time in those 3 states. In Florida, the margin was less than 100 votes. And that was after the Republican Party chairman had prematurely declared that Hayes had carried Baker County before the county's 2 Democratic precincts could even be counted. Newspapers across the country carried headlines that Hayes had won Florida, and by the time the Baker County figures were corrected, it was too late to reverse public opinion. Again, it was somewhat like Florida in the year 2000. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, the defeated Republican governor, Daniel Chamberlain, refused to concede the election to Wade Hampton. Instead, Chamberlain barricaded himself inside the governor's mansion behind a wall of federal troops, while Hampton set up shop a few blocks away in the state capitol building. A sense of stalemate existed. No one knew exactly what would happen next. The margins in Florida and South Carolina were so small that a plausible case could be made that Hayes had fairly won the election, or would have won if it had been fair. But in Louisiana, Tilden was ahead by 9,000 votes, and this was after the sewing machine swindle had cost him another 8,000 votes. Nevertheless, the Louisiana Returning Board threw out a grand total of 13,211 Tilden votes and awarded the state's electoral votes to Hayes. Democrats immediately began calling it the Overturning Board. Here we see the ballot box being kicked around like a football. In fact, organized collegiate football began the same year, 1876, when Harvard, Yale, Colgate, and Penn joined forces to create the Intercollegiate Football Association. Well, now in Columbus, Rutherford B. Hayes had done a complete about-face. He was saying that he was justly and legally entitled to the White House. Of course, Tilden had the opposite reaction. As he said, our presidential campaign has been subverted by a false count of votes known at the time to be fraudulent and forged. As usual, Tilden's instincts were razor sharp, but not even he could foresee just how bad things were about to get for him. When Congress met on December 4th to formally open the electoral ballots from the 38 states, there was a problem. There were two sets of returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina: the Republican version and the Democratic version. No one knew exactly what to do. The President of the Senate is constitutionally directed to open the ballots, and the votes shall then be counted. The acting President of the Senate was Republican Senator Thomas Ferry of Michigan, the Senate Majority Leader. He was in the post because Grant's Vice President, Henry Wilson, had died suddenly the year before. Here's a much younger version of Senator Ferry. He seemed to age about 30 years during the 4-month-long electoral crisis. Anyway, the wording of the Constitution was vague. Did it mean that the President of the Senate was supposed to open the ballots and count them himself? Or should he merely open the ballots and let the two houses of Congress count them? The Republicans, of course, said that Ferry should count them. Democrats, of course, said he shouldn't. If neither candidate received a majority of the electoral votes, the election was supposed to be thrown into the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment. Since the Democrats controlled the Congress at the time, the House, obviously Tilden would be elected instead of Hayes. Well, it gets even more complicated than that. In 1865, the two houses of Congress had come up with what was known as the 22nd Joint Rule, which allowed either the House or the Senate to throw out any votes that it considered questionable, something that had been done 5 separate times in the presidential elections of 1878 and 1872. At that time, both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans, and it was Democratic votes that were thrown out. But after the Democrats recaptured the House in 1874, it suddenly occurred to the Republicans that the same thing could happen to them. They voted immediately to recede or withdraw from the 22nd Joint Rule, thus preventing House Democrats from throwing out the contested ballots from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina and electing Tilden immediately with a simple majority of the remaining votes. Well, neither side would budge. You can imagine John Boehner, Paul Ryan, Nancy Pelosi, and Harry Reid in a similar situation today. Finally, an Iowa congressman named George McCrary a Republican, introduced a resolution calling for a special bipartisan committee to decide what to do with the contested ballots. The Senate followed suit. Meanwhile, the two candidates reacted in radically different ways. In Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes and his supporters actively reached out to Southern Democrats in a series of closed-door meetings in which they reiterated Hayes' determination to remove the final federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. In return, Southerners promised not to oppose Hayes from taking office. While Hayes was busy holding meetings, Tilden was sitting alone in his study working on a lengthy legal document that proved, at least to Tilden, that the 12th Amendment was still in effect and that the House of Representatives should elect the next president. Tilden was a brilliant lawyer by profession, and he made a brilliant argument. The problem was that it wasn't immediately followed. Had the House insisted from the start on its right to elect a president in a contested election, the Supreme Court probably would have upheld it, and that would have been that. Instead, for some reason, House Democrats did nothing for several weeks. One Utica, New York newspaper dismissed Tilden's legal efforts, noting that there was an inmate in the local insane asylum who considered himself the Emperor of China, but no one bothered to listen to him either. Finally, on January 17, 1877, over 2 months after the election, the congressional committees voted to create one single commission, the Electoral Commission, which would include 15 members, 10 senators and congressmen, and 5 Supreme Court justices. The commission was divided equally between Republicans and Democrats. And the 15th and all-deciding vote was supposed to be Supreme Court Justice David Davis of Illinois, a longtime personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, but a self-declared independent who had not even bothered to vote in the recent election. Here's David Davis in his prime, all 315 pounds of him. At the 11th hour, the Democratic-controlled Illinois legislature suddenly elected Davis to the U.S. Senate, mistakenly thinking that this would influence him to vote in favor of Tilden. Instead, it influenced Davis to immediately withdraw from the Electoral Commission and thus avoid having half the country hate him for the rest of his life. He was replaced by New Jersey Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley, a comparatively moderate Republican with long-standing ties to the railroad lobby. Here's Justice Bradley looking a little bit like British actor Christopher Plummer, I think. While the Electoral Commission was busy meeting in Washington, wild rumors swept the countryside. It was said that the Army was planning to take control of the government, install Senator John Sherman as president, his brother William Tecumseh Sherman as commander-in-chief, and throw all leading Democrats into prison. Meanwhile, Democratic rifle clubs were said to be gathering to march on Washington and seat Tilden at gunpoint. Tilden or blood was supposed to be their password. Tilden discouraged such talk. He said that it will not do to fight since we have just emerged from one civil war, and it will never do to engage in another. It would be the destruction of free government. Meanwhile, Grant promised to declare martial law at the first sign of trouble. Here's another Thomas Nast cartoon showing the strong hand of Uncle Sam clamping down on any democratic threats of violence. You can see where Tilden or blood and Uncle Sam is wearing a pair of monogrammed U.S. cufflinks. Finally, on February 1st, Congress began formally opening the ballots. Senator Ferry opening them alphabetically. When he got to Florida and its two sets of returns, the matter was immediately referred to the Electoral Commission. Deliberations were held in the old Senate chamber, which was the home of the Supreme Court. So as not to usurp the majesty of the court itself, commission members gathered around a small table on the chamber floor, while the Supreme Court justices' seats sat empty behind them. The only member of the Electoral Commission that anyone remembers today is James A. Garfield, and that's largely because he got assassinated 4 years later, shortly after being elected president himself. For 5 days, the Electoral Commission heard arguments from the two sides. Democrats argued that the commission had the right to go behind the election returns and investigate the way in which Tilden's victory margin in Florida had been transformed into a Hayes victory. They argued that they had legal precedent to do so under the 22nd Joint Rule, when Republicans had thrown out Louisiana's electoral votes 4 years earlier. Commission member George Hoare, a Republican senator, said Democrats must have a screw loose somewhere if they expected the commission to do the same thing again. So it all came down to one vote, Justice Bradley. At 2:13 p.m. on February 7th, he rose and began slowly reading his legal opinion. The commission, he said, could only rule on whether the governor had legally signed the election certificate, not what was in the certificate itself. Since outgoing Republican Governor Marcellus Stearns, just before leaving office, had signed that document, that was essentially that. A few minutes later, voting strictly along party lines, the Electoral Commission ruled 8-7 in favor of Hayes. The vote, said one Democratic newspaper, was 8 villains to 7 patriots. In Columbus, Rutherford B. Hayes immediately began working on his inaugural address. Samuel Tilden began making plans for a long trip abroad. The last remaining hope for the Democrats was to mount a filibuster in Congress that would somehow prolong proceedings past March 4th, when the Electoral Commission was due to go out of business. If there was no final vote count by then, there would be no president, and the House of Representatives could schedule a new election. Well, to prevent this from happening, Hayes's men in Washington held another secret meeting with Southern Democrats, this time in the Wormley Hotel at 1500 H Street. Here they worked out what was known as the Compromise of 1877. Ironically, the hotel was owned by an African American, James Wormley, who had trained in England to be a chef. Among those present at the meeting were Senator Sherman, Congressman Garfield, various members of Hayes's inner circle, and assorted Southerners. Once again, Hayes's people assured the Southerners that Hayes would remove all the troops from the southern states and end Reconstruction. One of the Southerners who attended the Wormley Hotel meeting, Louisiana Congressman William Levy, got up on the floor of Congress the next day and gave a speech in which he said that Southerners had been given solemn, earnest, and truthful assurances that Hayes, as president, would pursue a policy of conciliation toward the southern states. In other words, he would leave them alone and Reconstruction would be over. Levy's speech had the effect of immediately crushing the filibuster before it got started. Finally, at 4:10 a.m. on March 2nd, the now exhausted members of Congress met to formally certify the final results. Senator Ferry solemnly declared that Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio had been duly elected president. There was a chorus of boos from the crowd. The Cincinnati Enquirer said the next day that the monster fraud of the century has been consummated. In New York, Tilden received the news calmly. "It's about what I expected," he said. Here's a shot of Senator Ferry announcing the final results. It's still the only time in American history that a candidate has won more than 50% of the popular vote and not been elected president. Because Grant's term ended on a Sunday, Hayes was sworn in privately the day before to prevent any last-minute shenanigans. 2 days later, he was sworn in again publicly on the steps of the Capitol. It was all a show. He was already president, but perhaps given the circumstances, it was only fitting. Here's Hayes' inaugural. If you look very closely, you can see Hayes being sworn in by Supreme Court Chief Justice Samuel Morrison above the flag in the middle. There weren't a lot of Democrats in the crowd that day, as you can imagine. Hayes' presidency got off to a bad start when he promised, in the interests of national reconciliation, not to seek a second term, in effect making himself a lame duck as soon as he took office. Democrats, of course, didn't accept his legitimacy in the first place. They called him Rutherford B. Hayes, his fraudulency, and good old 8-7. Hayes did appoint some reformers to his cabinet, including one Southern Democrat, David Key, from my home state of Tennessee. He also appointed several of the men who had helped create and or serve on the Electoral Commission, including Senator Sherman, who had personally supervised the efforts to overturn Tilden's sizable majority in Louisiana, and had also taken part in the Wormley Hotel Conference that worked out the Compromise of 1877. Justice Bradley's son got a lucrative job in the New York Custom House. As promised, Hayes withdrew the final federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. Troops had already left Florida under a deal worked out in the final days of Grant's presidency. Ironically, the most sensational event of Hayes' presidency involved using federal troops in the North to put down the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, in which about 200 people, mostly Democratic strikers, were killed in the process. Hayes also supported what was known as the Resumption of Specie Act, which put the United States back on the gold standard and was designed to strengthen confidence in the American economy. That was pretty much it for Hayes' accomplishments as president, an unremarkable term of office that followed the most remarkable election in American history. When he left the White House in 1881, people said that he had come in by a majority of one and gone out by unanimous consent. Democratic Governor George Bernard said that Hayes had done so well that he almost wished he had been elected president. Several years ago, I was invited to give a talk at the National Arts Club in New York City, which is located in Samuel Tilden's old home in Gramercy Park. Here's a shot of the National Arts Club today. When the place was remodeled years after Tilden's death, workmen uncovered a false ceiling that for some reason was hiding the original, quite beautiful Tiffany ceiling in the library of the home. It's since been restored, and if you go there, you can see it in the bar of the National Arts Club. The club keeps a few private rooms upstairs for guests, and my wife and my son and my daughter and I were invited to stay for a couple days. The first night we were there, the director showed us around. Tilden's old bedroom on the second floor, where he went to sleep as president-elect and woke up not, is now filled with junk. A storage room filled with boxes, old furniture, and other assorted items. It's maybe as good a metaphor as any for his fate in the election. Anyway, the director happened to mention that the club had a ghost. The next morning around 5 a.m., my son Phil and I were awakened by something pounding on the door. And when I went to open it, there was nothing there. I don't believe in ghosts any more or less than the next person, but I like to think maybe after all these years it was just Samuel Tilden saying hello. Well, thank you all for listening, and I'll be glad to answer any questions I can. Yes, sir.
During all that craziness, did Grant retain all his office for his rights and so on as president? He never lost any of that. There was no interim.
Right.
Where there was no president.
Right. Yeah. The question is, was Grant still officially president during this long interim? Yes. He didn't leave office officially until March 1877, which is why there was such a huge rush to get the electoral vote finished before the Electoral Commission went out of power. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a general sense of why Tilden didn't put up more of a fight over this whole thing? It sounds like he was pretty laid back, which is surprising.
Yeah, the question is why didn't Tilden put up more of a fight over the process? He seemed sort of laid back. That's a great question. My sense of it was, and I can remember, I don't think Tilden ever expected to be allowed to take the White House. Grant had been president for 8 years. The Supreme Court was controlled by Republicans. The Senate was controlled by Republicans. The Army was controlled by Republicans. And I think certainly once he could see which way the tide was turning, he didn't really expect that he would win the final vote, and so he made the best legal argument he could. He was a lawyer, but other than that, he knew that there was no point in trying to fight about it because, as I said, Grant was president and he had a pretty good record as a commanding general, and so there was no way that Tilden could or even wanted to take power in that way. And also, I think he was a patriot himself, and he didn't want to see another civil war take place. So for those reasons, he was maybe a little bit like Al Gore in 2000. He just, for the good of the country and for his own peace of mind or whatever, he just said, "Okay, let's finish this." Yes, sir.
Hypothetical question. What do you think the direction of the country would have been if Tilden would have been president?
The question is what do I think the direction of the country would have been if Tilden was president? And here again, that's a great question. I don't think it would have been radically different. Obviously, Tilden would have removed the other troops from Reconstruction too. They'd actually Congress had voted to not fund any more troops after that year anyway. So Tilden, as a Democrat and also as president under the funding terms, wouldn't have kept the troops there. I don't think Tilden was a lawyer who had long years of experience with railroad magnates, and I think you could perhaps make the case that there wouldn't have been a huge strike in 1877 if he'd been president, because he would have been able to talk to the railroad magnates, and he would have also been able to perhaps have more influence over the Democratic unions at the time, so you wouldn't have had the whole railroad strike. Other than that, Tilden and Hayes were both hard money supporters who were against any inflationary greenback passage. So I don't. The most important thing, I think, is that if Tilden had taken office, he would have had an air of legitimacy that Hayes never had, because obviously with almost 1.5 million more votes by modern count, it would have been clear that he had won the election in a way that Hayes never managed to escape the notion that he had somehow stolen the election. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this Whitehall Lecture Series. This concludes our 28th year of the Whitehall Lecture Series. Roy will be at the back of the room signing books. His book, of course, is about President Hayes, and we'll look forward to seeing you next season, if not before. Hope to see you for other programs, but certainly hope to see you for next year's lecture series. I believe the theme of that lecture series will be Crimes of the Century, focusing on some of the amazing crimes that took place in the 19th century and how they were solved. So thank you all again. Thank you to our sponsors, the Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post.